everyone! Today we are going to be talking about fifth business. This is the second video of the three-part series here on Hello Hemlock. Deptford is definitely the version of Canada that I grew up in, and the parents and the families that Dunstan or Dunstable Ramsay grew up with, those are definitely characters or caricatures of people that I knew and grew up with. I think beyond the fact that the story starts in a kind of small town in Ontario and progresses to Toronto, I think there's some obvious geographical links to Canada, but the fact that his parents were Scottish immigrants, my grandfather was Scottish and he was from Aberdeen, and so I always felt very tied to that history and the fact that he wasn't from Canada, but Canada was his home. It was really crazy to me to read this book and feel like I could read about myself somehow. I think that's obviously speaking to a certain level of narcissism, but at the same time I think there's also a kind of connective and reflexive capacity that this book has to remind people of their role in their own lives. The fact that as the book progresses, you learn that the book and the story of Dunny is really about the people who he's surrounded himself with, or the people that he's never been able to rid himself of. Dunny always felt very guilty about what had happened in the very beginning of the book to Mary Dempster, and his entire life, or rather her entire life since she met him, they had been joined in some way, and it's really cool to see this character who is literally tied up in her own home, and yet Dunny is still somehow drawn to her. It's clearly not a reciprocal relationship. As she grows older, her mental illnesses get worse and worse, and they transform, and yet he's constantly still by her side. The same goes for Percy, who later becomes Boy, and he was the actual reason, potentially, that Mary Dempster went through the fit that she did, and the reason that Paul Dempster was born prematurely. The way that Dunny positions it is that Boy kind of keeps him around. He keeps him as part of this kind of collection, and Dunny gets to be the kind of eccentric, philosophizing weirdo that is very smart, very intelligent, but he doesn't really fit in with Percy's crew. And it's strange to me, but it's also totally understandable to me that he is happy to see himself as this addition, this kind of hanger-on. It's really beautiful, especially once you've read the entire story, to see how these 3 or 4 characters have kind of woven together. It seems as though you're getting introduced to a lot of people, and I mean, on the face of it you do meet a lot of people, and you are literally reading about this man's life, and you think of that as so overwhelming, but at the end of the book you realize, no, there was really just a couple of main players. And I love that Liesl comes in at the end, and she's kind of like the last section of the book, and she's supposed to be this grotesque creature, and she cavorts with men, with women, with anything that she finds intriguing or beautiful. And she riles Dunny up in a way that he hasn't been bothered to do so, because he's always considered himself, though he didn't come up with this term, he's always considered himself to be the fifth business, to be that kind of interlocking piece that isn't the spotlight, but it's necessary to build the house in the first place. And it's not something that people should be talking about or even noticing. He's trying to be this kind of fly on the wall, and Liesl riles him up and makes him get physically upset. And it's not that she was really just looking for sex. It wasn't that she just wanted to come on to him. It was that she wanted to dissect him. She had been watching him. And, you know, if we had the Book of Liesl, we might see that she found herself to be the fifth business and perhaps didn't want that role. But the guilt had only been thrust away, or thrust down out of sight, for here it was again in full strength, clamoring to be atoned, now that the opportunity had offered itself. Another element insisted on attention, though I tried to put it from me. If Mrs. Dempster was a saint, henceforth she would be my saint. Dunstable is, or Dunstan, is a writer at heart, and he is somebody who needs to find a kind of poetic justice and poetic license throughout anything that happens to him. Going to war and being injured in war and suffering through the war is a story in and of itself. But that's not where it ends. It ends with him seeing the face of Mary Dempster in the battlefield right before he loses consciousness, and then he wakes up months later after having been traipsed across the countryside, and he's in England, and the war's over, and that was the way that his story ended. Despite spending all of his time as a child with Mary Dempster, she was still such a stranger to him, to the point where he made the mistake later on in her life by mentioning that he had found Paul. It really reminds me of the William Morris quote. When a writer knows home in his heart must remain subtly apart from it. He must always be a stranger to the place he loves and its people. I think by making everyone and everything into a mythology and into this poetic story, he was able to be and maintain that position as the fifth business. So I'm not really sure what that means for Canada as the world's fifth business. I don't know that we are, but I do see a lot of merit in that idea. And perhaps it's because we are this collective and we come from settlers and immigrants that we don't have our own mythology. We don't have a way to build ourselves up in our own minds, let alone anyone else's. The Catholics have their saints, and every region in Europe seems to have their fairy tales, but there aren't really any Canadian ghost stories. I know that for a lot of people, we feel Canadian, but at the same time, we look to our parents or our grandparents and we know that they're also Canadian, but they're also not. They've come from somewhere else and they've got their own set of mythology and their own set of cultural, historical, collective values. And that's something that Canada has never really achieved. When we go off to war and go off to peacekeeping missions, we're definitely creating history for ourselves, creating history for the Canadian textbooks. But where we stand right now, we are really just that Dunstable Ramsay who is kind of connecting everyone else together and just kind of sitting in awe that we get to be here as well. If you haven't already, I really hope you get a chance to read Fifth Business by Robertson Davies. It has been a really amazing journey, and I don't say that often about books that I read, so I would highly recommend it. And if and when you do read it, I would love to hear what you think. Just a reminder, this month we are reading Carnival, and we are going to be discussing that in a couple of weeks because September is somehow almost over. Thanks so much for watching. See you later.